They used to say kings ruled the world, but by the end of the 18th century, it was the economists who quietly took the throne. I'm George, and you're listening to The History of Economics in 25 Scenes. Welcome to the 12th episode. How Economists Replaced the Monarch. When Adam Smith died in 1790, he didn't leave behind a perfect doctrine, only a luminous intuition that society could organize itself through freedom. His successors, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and later John Stuart Mill, inherited that faith and tried to turn it into science. They stripped Smith's thought of its moral warmth and dressed it in the precision of mathematics. What for Smith had been a living organism, guided by sympathy, became, you see, a mechanism ruled by law. The first great architect of this new way of thinking was David Ricardo, a London stockbroker of Portuguese descent. Where Smith had written as a philosopher, Ricardo worked like an engineer of the market. His Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, published in 1817, reduced the restless energy of commerce to equations of value, distribution, and trade. He argued that the true worth of a good came from the labor needed to produce it. Labor, not metal or decree, was the real foundation of wealth. From that base, he built a model of equilibrium, where profits, wages, and rents adjusted to one another like the weights of a finely balanced scale. And then came his most elegant insight, the law of comparative advantage. Even nations less skilled in every craft could still prosper if they specialized in what they did least poorly. Well, that was quietly revolutionary. For the first time, economics offered proof that cooperation, not conquest, could enrich the world. But in turning liberty into law, the classical economists drained it of feeling. Smith's moral philosophy of freedom became Ricardo's geometry of exchange. The human face of the market faded, replaced by the cold beauty of a perfect mechanism, impersonal, precise, and convinced of its own logic. By the early 19th century, Europe had crowned a new monarch. Not a man of flesh and crown, but a system of reason, silent, mathematical, and certain it could rule itself. Out of the ideas of Smith and Ricardo grew more than a theory. They shaped an entire civilization's sense of itself. By the early 19th century, economic liberalism had become more than a policy. It was a faith. The new gospel proclaimed that wealth, once tied to the will of kings, now flowed naturally from human energy and enterprise. To interfere with that process was to disturb the natural order of progress. Laissez-faire, let it be, became both slogan and prayer. At the center of this creed stood a single conviction: society prospers when individuals pursue their own interests under the discipline of competition. The first duty of the state was modest, to protect property, enforce contracts, and defend the nation. Anything beyond that was not governance, but, heresy, an intrusion upon the sacred autonomy of the market. This belief found its living form in the new middle class, merchants, manufacturers, professionals, who saw in liberalism both justification and identity. They were the self-made heirs of the Enlightenment, industrious, rational, proud of owing nothing to birth or privilege. The market rewarded merit. The state merely got in the way. To be free meant to work, to trade, and to keep the fruits of one's labor. From this spirit emerged a new moral order. Wealth became virtue. Poverty became failure. The invisible hand was no longer only an economic metaphor, but a moral one. Proof that success meant worth. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That prosperity itself could be a sign of grace. By the middle of the 19th century, economic liberalism had become the ruling religion of the bourgeois world. Serene in its logic, confident in its righteousness, and blind to the shadows it was already casting. Sometimes thought needs silence to unfold. If these ideas find a place in you, perhaps stay a little longer. Subscribe and walk with the library of ideas. There's much more waiting beyond this page. Let's turn it together. In a moment. The classical economists had preached harmony, the market as a vast mechanism that rewarded diligence, balanced interests, and spread prosperity through competition. But as the 19th century moved forward, a darker truth began to surface. The same forces that united society in work also divided it into classes. Liberty, it turned out, was not an equal gift. The Industrial Revolution had created two new worlds. The first was the bourgeoisie, owners of factories, machines, and capital. The second was the proletariat, those who owned nothing but their labor. Both were born from the same process of production, yet their destinies drifted apart. The factory floor became the stage for this new order, the employer calculating efficiency, the worker counting hours to survive. Freedom of contract looked noble on paper, but in reality, hunger makes a poor negotiator. Some thinkers saw the crack forming. Thomas Malthus, with his law of population, warned that poverty might be a natural shadow of progress. David Ricardo's theory of rent showed how wealth could grow passively in the hands of landowners, even as others toiled. Neither man sought rebellion, but both laid the intellectual groundwork for Karl Marx's critique, that capitalism carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. Productivity without justice, wealth without peace. By the middle of the century, the optimism of early liberalism had faded. Strikes spread. Slums multiplied, children worked where machines roared. The market, once imagined as a self-correcting organism, now looked more like a battlefield of competing interests. Maybe harmony had never been the natural state at all. Out of this growing tension emerged a question that would haunt the next 100 years. Can freedom survive when power and property belong to the few? The classical age had discovered the laws of economics, but it had not yet discovered the limits of liberty. Classical economics inherited from both Newton and Smith a fascination with balance, the dream of a universe ruled by law and proportion. The market, too, seemed to mirror this cosmic symmetry. Prices adjusted to demand, wages to productivity, trade to advantage. In that elegant geometry, poverty was seen as a brief deviation, inequality as a necessary statistic, and harmony as the natural end of all things. Economists became the new astronomers of society, charting the orbits of human desire as though people were planets moved by gravity. But that perfection existed only on paper. The invisible hand that Smith had once invoked with moral caution became, in the hands of his followers, an infallible God. It saw everything, except what mattered most: the distortions of power, the coercion of necessity, and the moral cost of inequality. In the real world, workers could no more choose their wage than the moon could change its orbit. Freedom in theory concealed dependence in practice. By turning liberty into a mathematical assumption, the classical economists quietly erased the human element. Their models described a world of perfect rationality, perfect competition, perfect outcomes. But humanity is not made of identical particles. It is driven by fear, ignorance, and ambition, variables no formula can ever fix. Well, that didn't stop them from trying. The myth of the perfect market became a theology of reassurance, a promise that disorder would always resolve itself, that greed would somehow yield balance, that history would obey algebra. It was comforting, even poetic, to believe that reason ruled the world. But in truth, equilibrium was not a law. It was a longing. The economists mistook their diagrams for destiny, and the harmony they described for the justice they never achieved. By the end of the 19th century, the language of economics had quietly reshaped how the modern world thought about itself. What had begun with Adam Smith as a moral reflection on sympathy and exchange evolved into something colder, grander, and far more ambitious, a kind of social physics. Human behavior was now described in the language once reserved for nature. Laws of motion, forces of demand, balances of trade. The vocabulary of virtue gave way to the vocabulary of measurement. The classical economists gave modernity its grammar. Words like value, labor, capital, production, and utility became the categories through which entire nations understood progress and failure. Economic growth replaced moral growth as the measure of civilization. Governments learned to think in equations. Citizens learned to think in prices. It was a revolution not only in policy, but in imagination. Life itself became quantifiable. This transformation carried both brilliance and peril. On one hand, it liberated the mind from superstition, making order seem graspable through reason. On the other, it enthroned numbers as the new judges of justice. If a policy increased output, it was good. If it hindered profit, it was blasphemy. The dream of balance began to eclipse the question of fairness. Maybe that's the secret irony of progress. The more we measure, the less we see. The triumph of economic thought revealed something deeply human: our hunger for predictability in a world that refuses to behave. The legacy of the classical age is this paradox. It gave us the confidence to measure everything, and in doing so, it taught us to mistake precision for truth. Even now, the modern mind still lives within that illusion. That justice, too, can be expressed as a number. So, that's all for today's episode of The History of Economics in 25 Scenes. New chapters appear every Wednesday, exploring how ideas built, and sometimes broke, the modern world. And every Saturday, we travel through the universal history of civilizations, where history is told through the lives, hopes, and heartbreaks of ordinary people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, well, you might want to. After all, in the marketplace of ideas, attention is the only real currency.